Thank you so much for coming today. It's very exciting to have an in-person event. It's been a long time. I'm Kathy Burke. I'm at the Woods Institute, and I'm co-leading the development of the Healthy Planet, Healthy People initiative, which is around a themed initiative around human and planetary health that will be in the new school as part of the Woods Institute. HPHP, as we call it, represents years of effort by the Woods Institute, the Center for Innovation in Global Health at the School of Medicine, and the program on disease ecology, environment, and health at the Hopkins Marine Station. Together, we've put together building blocks that are now helping to build the new school. But this isn't just about the new school. We'll be reaching out across campus and working with all the schools on subjects related to climate change, health, and other forms of environmental degradation. One of the building blocks we're most proud of is the Stanford LSHTM Human and Planetary Health Fellowship. And Britt, our speaker today, is one of the inaugural fellows. And so you'll hear about her awesome work in just a minute. After her talk, you can buy a book if you'd like and enjoy refreshments and networking. And if you'd like Britt to sign your book, be quick because she does have to go to another event this evening.
Another book signing.
Yes, yes. Anyway, I'd like to turn things over to our interlocutor for today, and that is Senior Associate Dean for Global Health, Michelle Berry. Michelle was very early to recognize climate change as a major health issue. I was her deputy for close to 5 years, and she was on this topic as early as 2015. While we're all concerned about the increasingly demonstrable health impacts of anthropogenic change, it's great to see that there's real momentum building for this agenda at Stanford and globally. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dean Berry, who will introduce our speaker.
And I'd like to thank Kathy. I'd like to thank Kathy for all her work in human and planetary health. And I'd like to give a shout out to Allison Phillips, who really developed the key of this planetary fellowship. For sure. So a shout out to Allison. And I'm thrilled to be here and actually moderate this session with the brilliant Dr. Britt Wray, who is really a brilliant thinker at the intersection of climate change and mental health. Climate and health has become really a major area of focus at our center. And it really, I trained as a tropical disease doctor, got interested in global health, but it very soon became it seemed that climate change was the major issue for my children, myself, and my children's children. So we quickly, we're trying to pivot our center to actually deal with these themed initiatives around human and planetary health. Today's event, co-hosted by CHGH in the Woods, features Dr. Britt Wray, who is presenting her newly published and widely acclaimed book, Generation Dread: Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis. This book explores how we as individuals and as a community can build resilience in an age of unprecedented environmental challenges and leverage the feelings of eco-anxiety to fight for a better world. Britt is, as you heard, our inaugural postdoctoral fellow in this unique program. The program is made possible by the generosity of donors, including the Moore Foundation, Stanford Sean and Parker Center for Allergy and Asthma Research, Bob and Kathy Burke, and most recently, the London School of Tropical Medicine Peter Piot Fellowships for Global Health Innovation. Britt has amassed remarkable achievements throughout her fellowship so far, including publishing a groundbreaking new study on climate anxiety that surveyed 10,000 young people in 10 countries and found these amazing statistics that 3/4 of respondents felt that the future is frightening due to climate. About half said that climate anxiety affected their daily lives, and about a quarter feared having children due to their climate anxiety. Britt is recognized as a global leader on mental health and the climate crisis. And in addition to her academic publications, she regularly publishes and appears in popular media pieces and runs a popular newsletter, which I love the title, Gen Dread. And really is, if you haven't signed up for it, you really should sign up for it. Her work has been quoted by the UN Secretary General as one side, and the other side, Stephen Colbert, and really has, even through the blockbuster film that Don't Look Up, which portrayed an impending media strike as a metaphor for climate change. Britt is also an active member of the Stanford community. In fact, she will be teaching a new course in our school, the new school, the Doerr School of Sustainability, next year. Britt is currently also lead authoring a paper on the need for women's leadership in the climate crisis and collaborating with Stanford's researchers to pilot a new intervention for eco-anxiety. Britt received her PhD in science communication from the University of Copenhagen. Her first book is The Rise of Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction, published by Greystone Books in 2017. It's my total pleasure to celebrate Britt's work and launch her new book with us today. And just for logistics, Britt's going to do some reading. I'll try to do a deep dive into some of her readings, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Britt, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berry. That was an incredibly generous introduction. And hello, everyone. I feel like I should stand for this part, and then I'll make it less awkward. I'll sit down when I do the reading. But this is so wonderful and a huge honor for me to be here with all of you today. Thank you for coming. And to be honest, I can say that without this book, I would not have a job at Stanford. I would not be researching the mental health impacts of the climate crisis in my day-to-day work. So let me explain what I mean by that. We are in an age of escalating eco-anxiety, which the American Psychological Association defines as the chronic fear of environmental doom. It's an intense but apt description for a feeling that I know well. And I first started having an acute experience with it in 2017 when my partner and I started considering trying to get pregnant. And, you know, as a science communicator with a background in conservation biology, my exposure to climate science was great enough to make me question whether bringing a new person into the world to deal with climate disruption for the rest of their lives and dangerous, deadly tipping points was really a wise thing or even a compassionate thing to do. I had never before considered connecting family planning to the climate crisis. And subsequently, you know, I was overwhelmed by this dilemma and forced to confront a lot of ecologically linked emotions that I didn't formerly have. And it troubled me, of course, but even more so, it really fascinated me and caused me to question, you know, if I'm having these strong psychological impacts from my awareness of the science, what are the emotional and psychological harms for those living on the front lines of climate disaster, environmental injustice, and pollution? What about the environmental scientists and activists? How do they relate to the psychological burden that comes with the heaviness of their data, that comes with their work? And how is eco-anxiety and ecological grief affecting people from all walks of life, including especially our young people, who are made aware of this crisis that they've unfairly inherited, along with the duty to clean it up, often before they have the opportunity to go out into the world and vote or explore important aspects of their identity? I explored those questions and what solutions we have as communities and as institutions to address the mental health impacts of the climate crisis while researching my book. And as I wrote it, I found my own ways of coping with eco-anxiety along the way. One important type of coping I discovered is what's called meaning-focused coping. And so this involves honestly assessing our circumstances while also seeking threads of purpose, meaning, and connection that allow us to express our values through our actions. So it helps people find benefits that arise from misfortune, no matter how challenging any situation gets. After confronting my climate emotions, which writing this book forced me to do in great depth, I found meaning in leaving the field I had just gotten a PhD in, and did whatever grunt work was necessary to develop a new specialty in the psychological impacts of environmental degradation, despite having no clinical or theoretical mental health training. Eventually, I was able to refocus my research on questions of what can be done to protect and improve young people's mental health in a warming world. So it started as a private preoccupation about whether or not to have a baby, developed into a new identity and a much deeper sense of purpose in my work. And I tell you all this not to pat myself on the back, but to point out that climate and environmental emotions can do so much in the world, and that for those of us who are feeling eco-anxious, we're each being challenged to figure out how we can harness these emotions for positive outcomes. Research has shown that the kinds of psychological distress about the climate crisis that I experienced are a strong predictor of behavioral engagement with these problems. And I would argue that eco-distress needs to rise to the surface and be met head-on for any of this transformational work to begin. So I wrote this book to validate the legitimacy of eco-distress, eco-anxiety, eco-grief. I include my own story to model vulnerability on this subject as an attempt to normalize what it takes to talk openly about big and challenging ecological emotions, because we need to talk about them in order to live well with them. I hope that this book will help eco-anxious people feel less alone while offering them some coping tools. And my political goal is for the book to help advance a global conversation about the mental health impacts of the planetary health crisis writ large, and what can be done to shift the bulk of mental health care provision from the narrow one-on-one biomedical model that we have now to wider communities of care that stand a better chance of scaling to meet the scope of psychic damage that the climate crisis is causing now and in the decades ahead, while paying attention to inequity and injustice along the way. Now I'll read an excerpt from the book's introduction, and then Dr. Barry and I will get into our conversation. I'll just put that there. Thanks. Okay. The emotional journey that comes with facing up to the environmental crisis can be intense, disturbing, and extremely painful. You'll know this if you've ever cried upon reading that a species you love is going extinct, or anticipated that you'll soon lose a coastline you call home to the sea, or witnessed livelihoods shrivel as year-on-year drought choked the land. It is stressful to live in fear of dangerous climate tipping points that, once surpassed, will unleash cascades of self-reinforcing environmental change, from ice sheet disintegration to permafrost loss and dieback of the Amazon, that cannot be stopped or reversed. It is infuriating to learn that this was predicted and preventable, but that a handful of powerful figures with entrenched interests knowingly and continuously sacrifice the future and people's well-being for profit. It is haunting to connect the dots between imperialism, colonialism, genocide of indigenous peoples, racial capitalism, industrialism, and extraction, and to reveal the shadowy footprints of these logics in the places where those who are most vulnerable to environmental traumas now dwell. Swarms of people are waking up to a sense that if nothing drastically changes, the fate of humanity will be like the slinky pushed off the top stair with no good structures in place to halt its energetic descent. Nothing could be further from what people want, but many feel powerless to stop this from happening, which has whipped up tidal waves of grief, anxiety, pessimism, and existential dread. The worst outcomes are not inevitable, and much can still be healed. But as emotions get bulldozed by world events and scientific predictions, the ability to create a more just and healthy world depends largely on how these difficult feelings are tended to. The young people who must confront the ill state of the planet they've been handed, and the elders whose cries for environmental change have been disregarded for decades are in an especially frustrating position, but also a potentially powerful one now that their voices are finally being heeded. The artists at the Bureau of Linguistical Reality, who are coming up with new language to better describe our changing world, have named a quintessential feeling of the times broken record breaking, a recurring sentiment of déjà vu, quiet terror, and slow shock, which is both acute and familiar, that occurs when opening a newspaper or radio program or website and reading a headline that year, month, season, or day has broken the record for the hottest on record. Many are struggling to stay afloat as we process the steady stream of scary environmental news that tells us things are unraveling even faster than scientists expected. Some lose themselves in activism, while others keep their distance or close their eyes just enough to pretend that the reality we face isn't nearly as bad as it is. For some whole communities who may be contending with the immediate practical threat of hurricanes, wildfires, heat waves, floods, and rising sea levels, closing one's eyes is not an option. Increasingly, even for those far away from hazard zones, neither is taking the time to examine one's emotional response. Over the last few years, especially but not exclusively in liberal circles, the term eco-anxiety has become all the rage. And it describes a condition that robs sleep from those who, when all is dark and quiet, stir in thoughts of how uninhabitable the earth will soon become. Tools are cropping up to help people cope with eco and climate anxiety, grief, and a pervasive sense of powerlessness to halt nature's destruction. Self-care guides, climate-conscious therapists, and a cottage industry of coaches have emerged to help folks grapple with ecological uncertainty and find community support, while focusing on the pro-environmental actions they can take. But acknowledging and reckoning with difficult emotions is still not the norm, and mental health resources are cost prohibitive or simply unavailable for many people who need them. Too often, though, the conversation around eco-anxiety reveals its own amnesia. Only some of us are being forced to grapple with the threat of annihilation and the emotional weight this carries for the very first time. For so many people who've been marginalized, the oppressiveness of how bad things are is a tale as old as the hills. As a white, cisgendered, economically secure woman, I have the luxury of dreading the future in light of problems like climate change, while others already acutely fear the present and have long been suffering for how they were treated by dominant power systems in the past. Unfortunately, the climate crisis creates a double injustice here. As the most marginalized, those who had the least to do with creating this mess, predominantly poor people of color, are disproportionately harmed by a warming world. Eco-anxiety researcher Panu Pikula says that waking up to the climate and water ecological crisis is particularly hard for middle-class citizens of industrialized nations, because the world is revealed to be far more tragic and fragile than people thought it was. This profound disruption, which can be as severe as an internal shattering, sends them into a grief-stricken process of mourning the lost future they believed would come, a future of ecological stability. This then erodes their sense of security. As more and more people who've been living comfortable lives wake up feeling eco-anxious, that awareness comes with a risk. If we only turn inward to recognize this pain within ourselves, instead of looking outward, to glean a sense of implication in the far-reaching and unequal consequences of the climate crisis and our agency to improve the outcomes, little will change. Better futures will be entirely missed if we get stuck in fear and dread. For those who might roll their eyes at the groundswell of anxiety and grief that many privileged people are now expressing, I hear you. We're going to get this wrong if we depoliticize this pain by not seeing its entanglement with centuries of environmental violence, racism, and domination. Without that context, we cannot be honest about who is the most vulnerable now and going forward, nor figure out how to best reduce harm. On the flip side, the tumultuous feelings that are on the rise are completely valid, need tending to, and present a great opportunity for justice-oriented personal, environmental, and social transformation. That's the reading.
I read this book on one long plane flight. It is absolutely a page turner. And one of the wonderful things about this book, at the end of each chapter, Britt gives you takeaway points, which are, they're really amazing bullets at the end of each chapter. It's a wonderful.
Glad you liked them. They make it kind of self-helpy.
No, I didn't think so at all. I actually found it really illuminating.
Oh, that's good.
So I want to get back to one of the statements. I'm glad you read that passage about your being a cisgendered, white, woman of privilege, financially secure. Many of us work in LIC areas or marginalized populations. So can you share a little bit of how one can partner against this eco-anxiety about climate change for those folks that are really worrying about food, worrying about, where their next issue is their next illness will come from?
Yes, yes. So, of course, anyone can feel this distress, and it's potentially overwhelming or potentially revitalizing if you recognize that your health is tied up with the health of the environment. And when it comes to eco-anxiety, there has been a bit of a reaction to say, well, that's just for the worried well. You know, that's for people who have the privilege or the luxury of doom scrolling rather than experiencing environmental harm. And while it's very understandable to assume that, given the layers of ongoing trauma that produce vulnerability to the worst impacts of the climate crisis right now, we do understand that it's not the case, that many of the communities feeling what gets associated with climate anxiety are on the front lines in disproportionate numbers to the worried well. We can talk about some of those studies later. But what this means for those who are privileged is to be able to use this as an opportunity to have a reframe and not be inward focused, but understand if I'm feeling this distressed about what's going on, how about those who are in less fortunate, more vulnerable positions than me with not being served by our systems for the psychic trauma that this will cause. It's an invitation for raising one's consciousness about climate justice, certainly, economic justice, gender justice, and all of the really, the intersectional ways we need to integrate our thinking around protecting people moving forward. So there has been, a conversation in the US about the whiteness of climate anxiety. If it operates like white fragility and causes white people to suck up the resources to focus on themselves, of course, that's incredibly damaging and dangerous. But it doesn't have to go that way. And I'm seeing a lot of evidence that it is the most powerful form of solidarity building to then make one's research or writing or community activism focused on partnering with communities that deserve the most support given disproportionate vulnerability. So if it means checking out the Climate Justice Alliance to get some ideas about how you might direct your work within the United States as a researcher there, that's an equitable way in. But I think the education piece around just understanding that we're disproportionately affected and that those with the most power and privilege have a responsibility to understand their implication and which nations have been creating the emissions, producing the problem, et cetera. And that we're talking about reparative work and what is owed in an increasingly difficult, uncertain world, then it can be, I think, a really powerful portal to that kind of justice-oriented partnership.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, you mentioned the self-help portion of, you think of your book. And when people talk about emotions surrounding climate, or scientists that actually talk about emotions, they're often relegated to this area. They're activists, not real scientists. Mm-hmm. Can you share a way how do we deal with that?
Yeah, this is something that has troubled me and really interested me for a long time. In the book, I interview a lead author of the IPCC who talks about her long and storied career in which she's used to staffers and policymakers always saying, oh, we can't listen to what so-and-so says because we know that they're on the side of climate disaster, and therefore we disregard what they present us with. And that person they're talking about is a very rigorous scientist who's working from empirical evidence that's reproducible. But because they bring in an emotional flair, they become advocates, and then they get disregarded as a result. And the easiest thing then a scientist like this woman, who is the lead author of IPCC, who I interviewed, what she can do to protect her work is to not speak in emotional terms, to be very objective, to be dispassionate, and then be able to understandably protect the value of the work so that it will hopefully be taken seriously. And this points out a lot of comparative judgment and fear of being seen poorly in the eyes of your colleagues that runs through scientific fields. For any average reader who is taking in headlines about the climate crisis, the feelings can be very immediate and overwhelming, but then there's no framework for integrating the data. And it's kind of the inverse with many scientists, where there's a surplus of good data, but then no framework for the emotions that come with that, which doesn't serve the scientists, because there is a psychological toll that comes with holding this knowledge that's getting heavier and harder as not only we're bearing witness to loss and degradation of ecosystems that many people devote their whole lives to protecting. But what's worse, and this is where the moral injury part comes in, and what many scientists have told me, the most painful part is then seeing that we have solutions that are not being taken up, and that people are denying the importance of making those maneuvers that we have the capacity to make. It's the denial, the soft denial, it's the gaslighting, it's, wasting the opportunity. And so all of this can produce a lot of mental exhaustion and burnout, which requires addressing. But we have not yet institutionalized this. And there are some important projects out there that propose, climate mitigation and adaptation specialists really need to be supported psychosocially to do this work so that they don't burn out, because we need those professionals to stay in the work for the long haul. And it can be tempting at a certain point to kind of quit and move to the countryside, which some have, including green political leaders who I've interviewed. And so one project, if anyone's interested, is called The Adaptive Mind, which I know we have someone in the room who works on it, and a climate adaptation social scientist named Susie Moser, which is really arguing that these kinds of psychosocial skills for coping with difficult emotions in the environmental sciences need to be as institutionalized as other types of technical skill building, and that it's ripe time for that, and that this will help retain resilient researchers moving forward.
Thank you. One part of the book that I also found fascinating is when you talk about this concept of human exceptionalism, how we as a species think we can sort of work our way out of everything, by dominating resources, issues of patriarchy, colonialism. But we're sitting in Silicon Valley now. Can you at all share? There's this feeling that innovation will get us over this hump of global warming. Do you have any feelings about this concept of human exceptionalism that you write so beautifully about?
Well, thank you. I certainly do believe that, because all hands on deck are required, technological innovation is one of the steadfast tools we need to continue working on, of course. It's not to discount that just because we have this history of exceptionalism that produces problems. We can be wiser about the ways that we harness these tools. But it's ripe time to radically reimagine what it means to build humane technology and focus on what we're measuring not only as GDP, but human and environmental well-being. And it's a powerful time for ideas about what that looks like, whether we're looking at degrowth economics, donut economics, something like the WALL-E, which is instead of disability-adjusted life years, well-being-adjusted life years as a metric for looking at investments and what's happening, or the impact of technologies that are being built. And I think what a powerful opportunity we have in Silicon Valley to bring these ideas into innovation meant to address the planetary health crisis that takes the externalities and the harms of what is produced on vulnerable communities and on vulnerable environments very seriously. But it does require shifting the metrics and having really rich, deep conversations about what is prioritized as opposed to growth first.
Certainly. One needs to prioritize that. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, I'm going to go back because I work more in LIC countries. How do you protect that lone voice? Because there is not a collective in many of these countries. It's usually one person speaking out. I put together a panel for sub-Saharan Africa, and I was looking for someone that could talk about human and planetary health. And it was lean pickings at a hard time. And the one person that I did find was an amazingly charismatic man that was interested in the greening initiative, the Green Wall in the Sahel. So, but he was out there alone. How do you suggest that you can inspire collective action rather than a single person here and there? Well, I mean, Greta does it great, but again, it's mostly in high-income countries. How do we get our partners in the less privileged or the marginalized communities?
we have to advocate alongside, we have to bridge build and think about capacity building in low and middle income countries as we're doing this work. I think it really is about listening to what people on the ground think would help them, you know, and offering one's time, one's mental power, one's resources to the extent that one can to understand what is contextually appropriate and what would help them build alliances. Of course, you know, helicopter approaches will probably cause more harm than good if we come in superimposing some structure or idea if we're not deeply embedded in the place. So I think it comes down to getting curious and wanting to co-partner through action-oriented research that takes advocacy seriously, but also the contextual aspects of what it means to interface with policy in that setting, and what will help, you know, move the needle there. So and to get interdisciplinary, right? And to not only look at, you know, one kind of advocate or activist or scientist, but or, you know, social scientist or humanity, bring in the arts. I mean, really try and create coalitions that can speak to different aspects of society.
And intersectional and intergenerational.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'd like you to just say, if you can, it's not in your book, but can you say a few words about women leadership in climate?
Oh yeah, sure. So women and girls are disproportionately harmed by a warming world in a very big way. And we have umpteen forms of evidence around this from different fields, but it calls on us to take this seriously through increasing women and girls' representation in spaces of leadership and identifying where power is held. So of course, at different scales, we can talk about grassroots organizations where many women are leading. But as we kind of move up and we get to national levels of representation, and then we get to international meetings and climate negotiations and that sort of thing, it is pretty appalling how low women's representation is in those settings. Not having the representation at the highest level of where power is held creates impoverished responses because it can allow more space for apathetic solution building that isn't really embodied through lived experience and understanding the different intersecting oppressions that make it hard for women to participate in the first place in many countries around the world, as well as the difficulty that a warming world is creating for their day-to-day lives now and in the future. So this is why representation matters. It's much more than like polite politics. It's really about working with embodied and situated knowledge and incorporating vulnerability into the innovation of response. And fortunately, there are many activists that are pushing for gender representative policies on climate and gender just policies on climate. We need to see much more of that, as well as whole campaigns around trying to make sure that there's 50-50 leadership from the top down at COP negotiations, which we're far from having so far.
So how are we going to treat this eco-anxiety?
Whew, yeah, lots of different ways. I mean, it is really beneficial to understand that eco-anxiety is not a disorder. It's not a pathology or anything to be ashamed about. It's many mental health professionals argue that it's a natural, normal, healthy response to a real unfolding civilizational threat. And so you should be proud to feel this way. If you do, it's a sign that you care, that you're awake to reality, that you're connected. It's a badge of compassion in many cases. The trick is to not let it become so overwhelming that your functioning gets impaired, right? And that you can tap into it for adaptive, constructive responses and taking action in multiple forms that you find authentic for you, rather than no longer being able to eat, sleep, concentrate, go to work, go to school, play, have fun, be in relationships. The things that our data shows us young people in great number are experiencing right now because of climate anxiety, eco-anxiety, and unfortunately, we already have cases of young people attempting suicide because of the intensity of their eco-anxiety. So it's firstly so important to step out of isolation. If one stirs in the feelings alone, it's made much harder to deal with. almost intolerable, but if given a containing setting, which in psychology speak is a place where the feelings are validated and mirrored and allowed, then things start to open up almost instantly. When you can come together with others who don't say, cheer up, you're fine, or you're being dramatic, or try to minimize the distress, but can actually stand in the fire with you, that creates tons of instant relief through mutual understanding and permission giving. And then some opening shifts become available for what to do with the emotions and how to start integrating them and allowing the difficult feelings to be there. A lot of us, we don't really have an emotionally mature culture at large around difficult emotions. We kind of have a lot of
understatement,
toxic positivity too, that we have to work our way through in order to just let the feelings be there and not judge and shame ourselves for having them. So even slowing down to feel our feelings is hard for a lot of people. And that you can start to do when you have input from others and work in groups. So there's a lot of, as I mentioned in the reading, like a cottage industry of peer support that's emerging to help people with this. One example would be the Good Grief Network, who have a 10-step program that's modeled off of Alcoholics Anonymous. Seriously, for moving people through eco-anxiety and grief until they come to a point where they're at the end actually able to reinvest the energy that they've lost from being so stressed out into meaningful actions at this time that are authentic to them. There's climate cafes, open-hearted meetings where people can come and gather and know that they won't be shamed and they can have frank conversations about how they're feeling and get that relief. There's a whole burgeoning field now of climate-aware therapists, so people who are organized in places like the Climate Psychology Alliance or Climate Psychiatry Alliances, and they're coming up with climate-aware interventions for helping people with things like PTSD from living through a wildfire, but also just dealing with the heaviness of eco-distress when it becomes overwhelming. And finding ways to really make meaning from the suffering. And importantly, move to a space of getting away from this black and white thinking that many people find themselves battling, which is like hope versus doom. And the thing is that it's very uncomfortable for all of us to hold two opposing thoughts in the mind at one time. And so we have a tendency to kind of split things off into binaries, and then we commit to one because at least then we can relax and it feels certain. Even if it spells out the apocalypse, that's better than the tension of gray zones, like that kind of a thing, which takes practice and is possible, but is not available as a kind of initial response often when the fear can become very overwhelming. And again, if there's not a framework for really integrating the data in a way that scientists might have available to them for the average person. So a lot of these therapeutic approaches focus on, helping people get comfortable with the fact that no one can reconcile this crisis as an individual, that there is an overwhelm there that is hard to manage, but that we have to get comfortable with ambivalence and incompleteness and imperfection and being climate hypocrites at the same time because we're all wrapped up in this system, not judge ourselves for that, and still move forward and find strength in uncertainty and what that means about what can come if we get together with others and address the problem rather than have our future, an idea of it, narratively foreclosed because of the stress that uncertainty puts our brains and whole nervous systems into. So those are some starting ideas, but what I'm most excited by is that there's a lot of rich ideas as global mental health researchers and practitioners and just mental health professionals in general and planetary health people. We can learn a lot. We're not starting from scratch about how to support communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis and the various layers of psychological distress that comes with this and acute trauma. So what happens when you need to get mental health services into a low resource area? There are countries where 96+% of the population that has zero access to mental health care has mental health problems and they can't get support. So global mental health researchers have innovated by coming up with what's called task shifting, for example. It's where mental health professionals, psychiatrists, let's say, no longer being the primary caregiver, become trainers. And then they start to train local people on the ground who are familiar to the people who need support And they are able to strip away the jargon and give them the counseling tools, even though they have no psychological expertise. And then they can help people in their community who they know through their schools, through their religious centers, community centers, et cetera, with the interventions of, let's say, managing anxiety and depression. And clinical trials show us that can be more effective than primary care. Because it's about building that community trust and capital and connectedness. And we also know that communities that have those qualities of being high in social trust and connectedness and social capital can ride disasters out better together than those who score low in all those dimensions. Psychiatric epidemiology shows us this. One example would be in a community that experienced a cyclone, looking at the mental health and children in the schools there who experienced, the roof coming off of their house, property being destroyed, people getting injured in their families, that the highest 10% of the most socially connected children, those who had other people in their lives to turn to and to trust and to confide in, they fared far better, significantly, in terms of their PTSD scores than the children who were in the lowest 10% of the least connected with the least social trust and least social capital. And it could be because feelings of isolation and alienation really eat away at resilience in more ways than we fully understand. And so there's kind of a co-benefit here to working in communities around the acute trauma and the eco-distress that comes with being awake to the climate crisis and experiencing it. Helps us get through disasters and rebuild faster when we have strong communities. And also, we can get beyond the fact that mental health professionals, seeing therapists, is expensive, and there's not that many people available to provide the services, so it can't scale really to meet the scope of psychic damage that the climate crisis will cause. And so we need to think, what does it mean to get outside of the clinic to support people in our communities if we are mental health professionals.
So you have a room with a lot of social capital here.
Yeah.
And a community that's very interested in this subject. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I wonder how much of this eco-anxiety has been exacerbated by this recent pandemic that we've been going through, and particularly how the world has responded. The fact is, it's been more than a year now that we've had vaccines, and there are huge parts of this planet where the vast majority of the population is still unvaccinated. And there are very explanations for that, lack of access, lack of resources, etc. But given how the world has responded to something very concrete, in which we have a solution for, how can one have any optimism about how we're going to deal with climate change, which is a lot more complicated, and there's various different facets to that problem, various different ways of addressing it. But we've done such a bad job with confronting this current pandemic.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence, does it? It's troubling. I think the pandemic has been this double-edged sword, both for what you're talking about, in terms of showing us how just non-compassionate we've been about taking those equitable aspects seriously and providing to people, and also cooperating about what science can do to protect us, and the social division and polarization and things that are not unfamiliar to us on the climate beat. At the same time, it's put public mental health on the map in a big new way, whereby we had not been discussing that mental health is really a direct result of the strength of our social fabric before at this scale. We often would, pathologize and talk about the unfortunate brain chemistry someone perhaps has, or the individual trauma that they experienced often as a source of that mental health issue. And now we can just make the argument much more clearly that our mental health is really directly tapped up with how we're caring for each other out in the wider world and in our social network and the social climate. So how has the eco-anxiety been exacerbated by the climate crisis? We do have more and more wide-scale surveys to show us what this is doing at population level. since the pandemic started. And it's hard to really pinpoint where it was at in those places beforehand because the research wasn't being done. So to really, as a scientist, answer that question, I can't do that. But we know that these feelings are not new and that they aren't coming up just as a result of this. Some studies have looked comparatively at COVID distress versus climate distress and found, interestingly, I'm thinking of one in the UK, for example, that for those who are likely to get wound up and very distressed about COVID, as compared with those who are likely to get very distressed about the climate, there was a significant difference whereby pre-existing mental health disorders were correlated with COVID distress, but not with climate distress, which raises an interesting question. But yeah, I mean, the 10,000 person study that we did, looking at 16 to 25-year-olds in 10 countries around the world, we were surveying young people in India, Nigeria, Philippines, UK, France, Brazil, US, some others. And we were trying to understand the scope and burden of climate anxiety in these young people's lives. And we found that 45% of that global aggregate said that climate anxiety is negatively impacting their ability to get through the day. So functioning, eating, sleeping, concentrating, going to work, that sort of thing. 56% said that they feel humanity is doomed. More than 50% felt that the things they hold most dear in life will be destroyed as a result of the climate crisis. And importantly, our results showed that it wasn't just that young people are feeling bad because the environment isn't doing well, but they're feeling this distress in very significant correlation to the sense of being betrayed by governments and lied to by leaders, which introduces the important concept of institutional betrayal and the psychological injury that comes when people with less power are depending on people with more power to protect them, and they're failing to do that, and it's plain to see. And there's moral injury that there's a lot of interesting research around, particularly from war experiences, when people are bound up in a system that's violating their own moral code, and they suffer in severe ways for participating in that system, which also applies to the climate distress conversation. So we know these young people are attributing it to climate change on its own. Whether that is being impacted by COVID distress, of course, it's a fair question, and it would be good to stake that out a bit more clearly. Yeah.
There were other questions? Yes. Can you say who you are? It's your name, and I hate, I like to know who talks.
Yeah, my name is Sean Fuller. I wandered in, I was involved in an organization called 6 Seconds.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I know 6 Seconds.
Used this formulation a couple times. People feeling free to take actions that are authentic to themselves.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious if you could describe what that positive outcome is like.
Sure. So what I mean there is that to be told what climate action you should take, whether it's, join this activist group, hit the streets with this protest, work on this policy, make whatever adjustment to your investment portfolio. Humans are fickle creatures, and we want to co-author or fully author our own stories. And things are more likely to stick if we feel that we've had a hand in doing that. But having some kind of outcome delivered to you, if it isn't authentic to what your skills are, what your talents are, what you're good at, whether you're good with spreadsheets or good with kids or whatever it might be, and marrying that with what brings you joy, like what gets you out of bed in the morning, what you're motivated to do, and how you like to spend your time. You need those two things to be working in concert with one another when applied to the work that needs doing in the climate and wider environmental crisis in order for it to be authentic to you, in order for it to be a really meaningful space of agency you can walk into and feel empowered by, and then throw your efforts into for not just a one-off event, but something sustained. That's what I mean by an authentic outcome. And it's also why a lot of these groups say, we're not here to guide you to a specific type of action, but we'll kind of give you a tour of what your journey could include, and then you can answer that for yourself.
Another question. Yes.
My name's Matt Schlegel, and I'm a teamwork consultant, and I help teams work on real big challenging problems that they don't think they can solve. And I've been using my framework to try to think about climate. And one of the steps in climate is actually connecting emotionally with the problem. And that's the impetus, and I just applaud you for highlighting that. But my question was, kids nowadays, right, they're starting to have these feelings about climate because they have this awareness about climate and they realize what's coming. And then they go home and the people who are in their lives, are now, continuing on their super high energy lifestyles, burning lots of carbon, and we're going to go to Europe and we're going to do this. And it just seems like it's going to present this cognitive dissonance to the kids. It's like, at school I'm being told that this is a big challenge, and I go home and nobody cares.
Yeah.
So how are kids managing that?
Not well. Yeah, I mean, we suffer unconsciously when living out of alignment with our environmental values. If there's a big gap between our actions and what we want to see in the world, whether or not we're having these conscious, formulated thoughts with ourselves about eco-anxiety, a lot of psychoanalytic work on climate shows that people can be very distressed, and that it can really account for why we hardly talk about the climate at all in society. It's not really that people are apathetic. It can be a refrain to say that nobody cares, and it can feel like for an activist or a scientist that they're walking around in a flock of apathetic humans, but really there is an unconscious discomfort and an anxiety and an ambivalence that is provoked by confronting our complicity in holding up these systems that are damaging our dear planet, right? Making us feel unsafe. And so it's easier to look away and turn away. But kids, especially feeling this in a big way and perhaps being around the dinner table planning some big tour with lots of flights with their family, but then going to school and learning about what feels to them like the end of the world, is resulting in classrooms filled with despairing students. So environmental instructors from a variety of different fields have come together, and they have actually created this thing called the Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators, because they came to a point a few years ago of saying, I am simply trying to do my job and deliver the information that I must as a lecturer, and I am traumatizing my students. They come into these environmental programs bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, motivated to take on the world, and then they leave demotivated, depressed, and feeling as though it's really hard to authentically connect with a sense of hope about what they're going to do. And so we need to create space for the emotions, and we need to contain the emotions in the lessons and not just deliver more and more traumatic scientific evidence, but then bring in the arts, bring in the humanities, bring in psychology, bring in different ways of exploring the human dimensions of this work. And there's particularly one course at the University of Washington that's been really great on this, because they have data looking at before and after, like what happens when science students come into the course at the beginning and what happens when they leave. And this is a course designed specifically for trauma-informed methods for doing environmental learning. And they come in despairing and hopeless, and then they leave radically transformed, understanding that even when the going gets tough, humans pull together and help each other, and that this grief is a part of a bigger emotion of love, and that there's a lot of strength to be mined by exploring the feelings, allowing them to be there, and then point out what kind of person they're going to be at this time with others who also care. And then they feel psychosocially supported. So I think that's relevant for what you're asking. Also, just to be able to have those conversations, and wherever young people are finding themselves caught in that schism between lots of distressing information and then feeling as though no one's tracking that this is happening. And it just is about piercing the bubble of silence and bringing in that emotional element that can reduce a lot of the distress.
I don't know why every kid isn't going out and doing Fridays for Future.
That's what I was going to say, Fridays.
Yeah.
I mean, Greta has a model for how to
Absolutely.
build a community, take power, and all that. So it surprises me that we're not doing more of that yet.
And why we all aren't supporting them across our generational age ranges. We can all get out there and be part of Fridays for Future. Yeah.
Fridays for Future, Palo Alto, City Hall, every Friday at noon.
Nice.
I am out there every Friday.
Are you? Oh, wow, amazing.
Yeah.
That's so
That's
cool.
cool.
Week 19
Wow.
is this
So
Friday.
where is it? It's City Hall?
City Hall, yeah. Every Friday.
That's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, just creating the platform.
Now, do you have kids and you take your kids?
I have older kids
Okay.
and they're off doing their own thing, so.
Fair.
All right. I have to get my grandkids there.
Yes, please.
Other questions?
Hi, Phil.
I'm Philip Campbell, I'm editor-in-chief of Springer Nature, and I'm really interested in your point about the social being so important. I'm sure that's true in the COVID environment as well. So what are the barriers to that really being, that message getting through to the professions, to maybe private suppliers of social, can the government help? And I'm not just thinking in the US, I'm thinking around the world.
Yeah.
And the evidence base for the social, what's that like? Because policymakers really need evidence.
Right. Fantastic question. Thank you. On a philosophical and just sociocultural level, some barriers include that we are living hyper-individualized lives in many of the industrialized nations that are most responsible for making the crisis worse, but also need to get a handle on these kinds of social interventions here and in other countries. More people live alone now than ever in human history. Loneliness has emerged as a public health epidemic, and we're living with a hangover from many decades of neoliberalism that have kind of entrenched us in individual formations, right? So we have to work through that. And then also in terms of the evidence of why these community approaches really have teeth, we can look to research from the mid-20th century from sociologists and psychiatrists who came together to look at what the mental health impact is of raising social capital. I'm thinking of someone like Alexander Layton, who was a psychiatrist and sociologist at the same time. And he did this groundbreaking study where he followed a community in rural Nova Scotia called the Road for many decades. The people of the Road were thought to be, by their surrounding neighbors and other communities, I quote, delinquent, lazy, inbred alcoholics who were up to no good. Basically, in this community, there was high marital strife, child abuse, mental health problems, low engagement in civic life, high hopelessness, alcoholism. And Alexander Layton got the idea that if this community were to be supported just minimally by the authorities to be able to take up whatever skills they need to come together and lead and follow. So essentially learn the skills of cooperation. And if they could identify a task that they wanted to achieve together and then achieve that goal, something interesting might happen. The community was supported to come together by the community, by the commune authority, and given a small amount of financial resources, but they were asked what they wanted to do. They said, we want to electrify the local schoolroom so we can watch movies. And then they learned how to cooperate amongst themselves to come up with multiple pathways for fundraising until they got the electricity and could enjoy their movies. That increased their self-efficacy, their belief that they can actually achieve their goals. Then the next task-setting conquest was set up for them. They put their eyes on another goal, they solved it, and so on and so forth, until less than 1 decade later, when analyzing what had happened there, the houses were tidy, there was far less marital strife, people were engaging in church and in the community, and the mental health problems had all but disappeared. And so this led Alexander Layton and colleagues to conclude that helping a community come together to increase their social capital has profound impacts on people's mental health as individuals and the robustness of the community and civic life. So this is the basis of what the prolific climate and mental health researcher Helen Berry calls the pearl in the oyster for good mental health care in the climate crisis. You can bring people together and ask them to think about what's helpful for them. What do they need in the climate crisis? Do they need a better messaging system to protect people when heat waves are coming? Do they need to deal with a toxic waste problem in their backyard? And then people can work together to follow and lead and increase the social trust and connectedness, and then ride through these challenges together. And you never have to even call it mental health work, but it helps to increase that social protective benefit and recovery from mental health problems. So psychiatric epidemiology is filled with these kinds of examples, and I think that they're really exciting because they're super low cost and they're readily available.
So can I ask another quick question? Because I was just listening and thinking, because we were talking about how marginalized populations, they have the least voice. But if you think about one marginalized, vulnerable population, are indigenous groups. They're very in touch with climate and very in touch with the land. And how do you think that evolved? And why can't we evolve into a humankind like that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think many of the most vulnerable communities to climate impact have a lot of voice within their communities about how important the land is to them. And when it comes to, indigenous peoples, for example, many, if not most, indigenous communities have a deep relationship of interconnectedness, mutualism, reciprocity with not only the land and other species, but features that through ideas of animism are actually considered living and have garnered the utmost respect. And ideas of thinking, for example, 7 generations out into the future, so always calculating what the impact of decisions made now will do to impact people that far into the future, which is deeply caring and interconnected, and forms of kinship that many of the kind of dominant forces in culture right now are not exhibiting, as we of course are dealing with intergenerational injustice issues. So it's powerful to look at the research done on ecological grief, for example, most of which came out of research in the Inuit communities in northern Canada by a woman named Ashley Consolo. And there, people are identifying that because they're Inuit, they're people of the ice, but the ice is no longer there for many months of the year when it used to be. And so, that means that they can't carry out traditional roles like hunting and fishing or traipsing where their ancestors have for thousands of years, which is spiritually diminishing. And then what do you do when the thing that made you who you are is no longer there for you? It's profound grief and loss, and it also comes as another layer of the harms of colonization as they have to pay the cost of this degradation to their environment in a crisis that they had nothing to do with contributing to in terms of emissions. So this is where we understand that ecological grief is about more than just a specific kind of loss. It's also about anticipating future loss, understanding that we're in these cascading systems that are shifting, and it brings about a pre-traumatic stress rather than just a post-traumatic stress. So again, the justice issues that you're talking about are just so key for looking at how this shakes down differently in different communities.
Last questions? Any last question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Alexia. I'm a researcher in a Stanford lab. So I realized that social media is a huge platform with a lot of information, and I think a lot of environmental health groups are using it as a tool to advocate. And so I found myself also relying on social media as a source of information, and in some ways I felt empowered, but in other ways there was just too much information where I felt kind of burnt out, and I felt that climate grief get stronger.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have any suggestions and how we can use social media as a tool for empowerment, and if you have any recommendations on how we can do that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's really easy to entrap oneself in distress by staying on social media. And of course, deleting apps is a recommendation that I hear again and again from certain therapists about what to do with the doom scrolling feeling that many people just have permanently now. And it's important, of course, not to turn away from the alarming evidence, but the question is, how do we make ourselves big enough to also let in the nourishing and joyful stuff? And I think an important aspect of what social media can do is make climate action a politics of desire rather than a politics of loss and degradation, and really highlighting and bringing in the exciting, joyful, resistant, resilient, fun, experimental, humoristic elements that also come with this crisis, because it is so all-encompassing. It touches all aspects of life, and therefore it can also touch all those good things too. But we're being challenged to be creative about now, okay, it's here, we're gonna have to learn how to live well with it. That means that we need to bring in those things that fill us up, even though we're not used to dealing with environmental campaign material that way, you know? And I think that social media, there are many creators on there that are exploring this now, whether they're climate comedians or, you know, intersectional environmentalists or, you know, different kinds of artists. And it's time, I think, to foreground more of the humanities, not to let go of the science and policy and, you know, technological arguments. Of course, we need those, but really also bring into the foreground all the other kind of soulful ways of relating to it: humanities, philosophy, literature, art, etc. So if you're doing that work, that's really great, and I thank you, because we need more of it.
Well, I'm going to thank you, Dr. Wray, for a very interesting conversation and a fantastic book.
Thank you so much.
And I want to also thank my team out there, Erica, Harleen, Lena, Fanya, for putting together this event. Thank you.
Big thanks to all of you. Thank you, Michelle.